We can start. The session is the third session that we have here. Very crowded, I can see it, but I'm sure that people are attending our session virtually. This topic could be the hot potato, aging and public finances. Can we afford to grow? Okay, first let me introduce myself. I'm Aris Alexopoulos, the head of the OECD Crete Center on Population Dynamics, but I'm also a professor of political science at the University of Crete. Actually, I prefer more the role of the professor, but it's so challenging, this role, the new role, so we have several professors here. I'm sure that they prefer the role of the professor than the other job. So the session focuses on the key challenges to public finance arising from population aging, notably on pensions and health and long-term care, the impact on negative or positive on government revenue, which is threatening in case that it is negative fiscal sustainability. Aging also impacts debt dynamics through the effect on the interest rates growth differential. Such effects can be mitigated at least in part through comprehensive policy actions, including measures to contain spending or raise tax revenue, but also through structural reforms to boost employment and potential growth. Reforms in the labor market, adult training, measures for better integration of immigrants. These are the topics that we're going to discuss in this session, but first we need a bit of stimulation. And Dr. Felice Zunzal, who is head of Structural Policy and Research Division of the Economics Department at the OECD, is going to address the issue of fiscal impact on population aging. Felice is a trained economist. She worked for the IMF before, leading various policy and research initiatives and country missions, and she has published with an impactful manner in policy making extensively. So, Felice, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks, Aris, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. So I would like to thank the organizers, the Delphi Center, of course, for their support for the forum, but also all of you that is making us feel home during this event. I'm Turkish, and I also worked at the IMF, but I'm a friend. Just wanted to mention. So, of course, we are living longer lives, and perhaps it's a testament to our advancement in healthcare and quality of life. As it has been mentioned before, this is a great achievement for humanity. But as we celebrate this progress, we are also faced with a new economic reality, which is that how to address the fiscal costs of these extra years, ensuring a resilient fiscal outlook and reduce pressure on debt sustainability. So today, this is exactly what I'm going to focus on. And this is a paper we prepared for the Crete Center, Crete Center's work agenda, and I'm very pleased to be presenting here today for the first time in Chania. So you have seen different versions of this graphs before. We mentioned many times that the population aging is a key demographic trend facing most economies, even those with younger populations. As life expectancy increases and fertility rates decline, the share of older cohorts in overall population rises steadily. And of course, the timing, the speed, and the scale of the aging process differ across countries. Still, across OECD economies, on average, we see that the share of population aged over 65 doubled between 1960 to 2022 to 18%, with projections up to 30% by 2060. During this period, population aged over 65 grew at an annualized rate at 2.2%. That is compared to 0.9% growth for working age population. So we have 2.2% annualized growth for older populations and 0.9% growth for the working age population, which brings the dependency ratio increase. In fact, from 1960s to 2020, the dependency ratio doubled across OECD economies. So population aging affects public finances through multiple channels. Of course, aging will weigh on labor supply and labor utilization, through which it affects productivity and potential growth. At the same time, population aging changes the old age dependency ratio, and by doing it, it has an impact on investment and savings, and through which it also feeds through the productivity. So when we bring the fiscal element through the impact on productivity and potential growth, you see that it has an impact on tax revenues, and therefore it affects the budget balance. From the spending side, as mentioned before today several times, it affects pensions, health expenses, long-term care, and other expenses. From investment saving side, it has an impact on interest rate. It actually goes in the opposite direction, because as people are saving more and the accumulation of assets in the economy increases, the interest rate, the neutral interest rate that we usually say, it goes down. So it helps in terms of that sustainability. When you think of famous R minus G accounting, it actually helps government debt to be more sustainable and have fiscal space. So we have tax revenues and government spending, tax revenues decreasing, government spending increasing, and interest rate declining with aging over time. So when we look at the different, how the aging comes into government fiscal budgets, of course we have the pension expenditures, healthcare expenditures, and long-term care. In all of these three elements, public spending is the biggest share of the overall spending. You see that for the pension, it's about 9% overall of GDP, and only 1.5% is the private expenditure. For the healthcare spending, the same pattern, maybe a little bit more. Again, about 7% is public spending, and only about 2-3% is private spending. And the same, even smaller shares for the long-term care. So just to zoom in on the public pension spending, you see here that across countries, of course, there's a large variation in terms of how much aging could put pressure on public pension spending. These are the simulations from OECD's long-term models we update for all the countries, which we will be, as I mentioned before, we will be publishing as the Chris Center working paper very soon. So here you see that there's a large variation across countries. Of course, this reflects different demographic structures, differences in their programs, for example, the coverage of the pension benefits, etc. And of course, whether the pensions are financed through the public or the private sector plays a bigger role. Now, when we look at the estimates from 22 to 2060, we see that compared to 20 years ago to early 2000s, there's 1.5% increase in public pension spending as a share of GDP on average across OECD economies. And in some countries, such as Finland, Greece, and Portugal, these increases are much larger. So when we take these numbers forward to 2060, we are actually projecting another 2% increase on average across OECD economies. Now, when we look at how the fiscal accounts will be affected from the public health spending side, you see that from in early 2000s, the public spending as a share of GDP was just around 6%. Now we are around 7.5%, 8%. And as we go another 20 years, 30 years, we are looking into 9, 10% increase in GDP. This is about, in many of the OECD countries, this is about 15% of government spending. So it's actually quite large numbers that we are talking about. In terms of the expenditures on longer-term care, the numbers are actually even more staggering. You see this increasing surge that we expect in longer-term care as we move towards 2060. So now, in our quantitative assessments, when we look at different policy options and take these numbers to 40 years in time, it becomes very clear that addressing the aging-related costs in fiscal paths and debt outlook requires a comprehensive approach to fiscal policy that address different directions. None of these, just to make it clear, none of these bullet points will be by themselves enough to address the issues, the large fiscal costs that we are facing. But we need all of them, and we need all of them pretty quick. So let me just show you some of these impacts on how they quantitatively look in our simulations. So here we see that in this graph, the longer working lives could ease fiscal pressures. Specifically, we are stimulating here reducing retirement pathways, early retirement pathways, and keeping the effective retirement ages by rising 2/3 of the future gains in life expectancy. So if the life expectancy is supposed to increase, let's say 30 years going forward, we assume that 20 years will be increase in working age. Of course, it's much smaller. So you see that this will bring about 3% decline in the fiscal pressures going to 2060. And in some countries, such as Belgium, Spain, France, Italy, and Luxembourg, actually the gains are even much larger. So, of course, the fiscal impacts of these reforms depends largely on the extent of which people who leave social protection programs come back to the labor market. They could be equipped to be re-engaged in the labor market, especially in the light of the evidence of strong spillovers across different welfare programs. So another thing to point out here is that when we look at the long-term care, it's very important to realize that the public support is a key part of this, and it's going to be a key part of this. Because the healthcare, the longer-term care is very expensive, as it was mentioned before. And in the case of care for severe needs in particular, the average cost across OECD countries will be more than twice the median income of the older people, and even exceeding this twice the median income in countries like Netherlands, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. So in that sense, promoting home care could help contain some of the institutional costs and satisfy the preferences of older people. So now there is, of course, it was mentioned before, there's a scope for further increasing employment rates for elderly groups. We see that since about 2000s, the employment rates for elderly groups has increased in general across different countries. However, there is still a large variation. For example, in countries like New Zealand, Korea, we see that half of the people above 65 is still working. When it comes to France, the number is 3%. So there's a huge variation across countries, and there are large gains to be made by retraining these people and putting them into labor force. Of course, the improving supply side should be accompanied by efforts to increase the demand for older workers by reducing barriers to their employment, such as mandatory retirement in private and public sector and seniority-based wages, which again also was mentioned before. So again, in our longer-term model, we try to assess what will be the quantitative impact of structural reforms that activate not only older workers, but also other underrepresented groups, such as women, disabled workers, etc. As you see here, if you're thinking of 2060, by incorporating, by putting the labor force, older workers and women and disabled populations, the fiscal pressures could be reduced about 4 percentage points. Again, by itself is not enough, but it's a very relevant number in the context of the fiscal pressures many OECD economies are currently facing. And of course, the advances in healthcare, income, and living standards have increased the life expectancy in all countries, with more than 2/3 of these additional years of life expectancy spent in good health. This is a great achievement, as mentioned before, and holding the promise of more productive older populations and longer living lives. So we can alleviate the fiscal pressures of population aging as long as countries are prepared for demographic transition, which implies that using various different policy levers in a complementary way. So just to conclude, again, the migration is not a panacea. It will not be the only solution, and however, it can still help, especially given that most of these immigrants tend to be much younger and tend to be much more fertile, although they tend to adjust to the host country's standards pretty quickly. Still, even just from looking from the labor market side of things, we see that they can help address the skill shortages, and therefore they can help contribute to the GDP of the economy. So I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Feliz. I think we had enough stimulation. I will refrain from comments, and we have 40 minutes, a bit more, for our panel discussion. To start with, I start with Panos Tsakloglu. Panos Tsakloglu is Deputy Minister of Labor and Social Insurance, but as I said, he is a professor of economics at the University of Athens. And his research focuses on economics and social policy, labor and education economics. And I go straight to my first question to Professor Tsakloglu, which is, what is the impact of population aging on population pension systems? I said it's a hot potato, but give us the cause and then the solution, please.
Right. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, and let me extend my best wishes for the success of the OECD Grid Center, and this depends to a large extent on you.
Oh, thank you.
Let me start with a personal story. By training, I'm a development economist, and I started teaching back in 1980s. Mm-hmm. At that time, in the textbooks of development economics, there were several chapters that they were focusing on population explosion. What are we going to do with the growing populations, especially in developing countries, of course. Nowadays, if you get, let's say, any textbook of development economics, such chapters do not exist anymore. Even at that time, 80s and so on, it was very well understood by demographers initially and later on economists as well, that in developed countries we had exactly the opposite problems. We had a rapid declining in population growth rates, and there was the expectation that sometime they may even become negative. The debates of that time started influencing policies as well. And there was the question then, what can we do in order to contain spending on age-related policies, and especially on pensions? I will speak mostly on pensions, and if you allow me, I will say a few things about other areas as well. There were 5 types of policies that were introduced in most European countries at that time, gradually, not all of them at the same time. And what were they? First of all, and I must say that almost everything that I'm going to talk about has already been covered by somebody else here, especially by Alvaro Pereira. I can see him there. And in fact, the first type of policy measure that they took at that time, it was, let's say, abolishing schemes for early retirement. Believe it or not, such schemes do still exist in some European countries, and they were quite evident in your graphs. In some countries where the distances were quite large, with or without implementing policies and so on, were precisely the countries that still have some policy leftovers there as well. The second was to make the system less generous. The assumptions of the system when it was built. First of all, we are talking about systems that were in their core, they were pay-as-you-go, benefit-defined systems. They were built for a period where, as somebody mentioned before, people were working until they were 60 and they were retired, they were living, let's say, until they were 65. When all this longevity started demonstrating itself, they started to making far less generous replacement rates. The third policy, it was something that is still being tried by several European countries, and it turns out to be the least popular with the general population. It is linking the pensionable age with life expectancy. Not life expectancy in general, but life expectancy at some relatively late age. For instance, some countries have 60, others have 65, some others even later. If you see what's happening, what was the reaction, for instance, in such reform recently in France, you can understand that the difficulties that governments face in order to implement policies like them. However, all academic evidence that we have at the moment, seem to suggest that this is the most effective policy in containing spending pension. Some countries have gone even further than that. They have introduced automatic stabilizers. When spending pension exceeds one particular level, then there is, let's say, some kind of clause for decline in pensions and so on. Not the majority of the European countries. And finally, there was another type of structural policies that was undertaken at that time. They were either established or they strengthened existing systems of the second pillar, that is occupational pensions or auxiliary pensions and so on, that they were not distributive, they were not pay-as-you-go, they were fully funded systems so that they support the living standards of the population when they come to later age. Now, I must admit that Greece was one of the countries where these policies were not implemented, and unfortunately they were implemented in a very forceful way during the time of the economic adjustment programs. All of them, apart from the last one that was introduced a few years ago. We do not have automatic stabilizers. Now, what else can we do in order to contain not spending, but to preserve the overall fiscal balance of the government? The first of all is to increase, let's say, labor force participation. Labor force participation differs substantially across European countries and differs in particular groups. Niki Kerameus, the Minister of Labor, later on identified 4 groups where in most European countries we have employment rates that are substantially below the national average. Women, youth, persons with disabilities, older workers, especially workers that are already in pensionable age. The rates of labor force participation across these groups in the various European countries differ substantially. However, all countries have started to provide either positive or negative incentives or disincentives for these people to stay longer in the labor market. Then the next question is the question about migration. About migration, it is something that is perhaps an even more unpopular topic in most European countries in the public discourse. If we look at human history is a history of migrations. We must not be scared about it. On the other hand, I can understand that uncontrollable migration can lead to situations that are politically unsustainable. There is no question about it. What are the components of successful migration policies? I have the feeling that there are several studies there. There are 2 types of policies that stand out. One is that the migrants must be complementary to the local labor force. This is something that is increasing overall productivity. And the second thing, which is far more difficult, is that migrants must have a social integration in the country where they are moving to. The other things that we can have are far more long-term. Is it possible to increase Fertility. The answer is probably yes. From several surveys that we have available, it seems that people do not desire to have very large families. However, they desire families that are larger than the ones that they are actually getting. Instead of one child, to have 2 children and so on. From this point of view, I have the feeling all these measures that they give incentives in this direction, they are in the right, they are highly desirable. We have introduced several policies like them in recent years in Greece, and we do hope that they will have the desired outcomes. However, there are 2 things that we must take into account. First, it is that even if these policies are successful, their effects will be evident in the labor market in the next 20 years. Therefore, the gap is there to be filled somehow. The second is that people probably they are trying to justify these policies on arguments that there are particular needs of households with children and so on. I have the feeling that there is another argument that is even more compelling. If we are living in pension systems that are distributive, then children are public goods. If there are more children, they will fund the pension of people, even of those who are childless. And this is something that I do not hear very often in the public discourse, even among economists. Finally, when we are talking about there are several other things that can increase productivity, therefore they can increase, let's say, social insurance contribution and contribute to sustainable public finances and so on. People have already spoken about, let me not repeat that. Finally, there is one point that I would like to make, and I liked very much the presentation of my friend Tito Boeri before. However, there is one particular point where I'm far less optimistic than he is. Tito mentioned there in the closing remark that we are in front of some period where we will have increasing bargaining power of younger population. I doubt it. Fortunately, we are living in democracies. And democracies that we have older population, I'm very much afraid that we have to convince them that it is to their benefits, to older people, that they must not overburden younger generation. However, whether the outcome will be a positive one, I hope it will be, but finally, let me just say a few things about other policies apart from pensions and the impact they have on public purse. Every 3 years, the European Union is producing a report that is called the Aging Report. It is focusing on 4 areas. I do not know, perhaps you are, Angela, may be part of that group there. They are focusing primarily on pensions that I referred to before, health, education, and long-term care. Let me go very briefly through them. Quite a lot of discussion about the impact of on public finances comes from the expected health spending. There I am a bit more optimistic. If we look at the data, although Professor Supramanian in his intervention mentioned some slightly different numbers, from the time I was teaching health economics, if I remember well, 2/3 of the expected spending on somebody's life is spent in the last year of our life. They are the so-called death-related costs. We only die once. Therefore, there may be, Nikos doubts it, but yeah. There may be, let's say, older populations, they have higher health needs. However, I think that this is something that can be sustainable. For education, Aging Report tells us that most probably we will have a decline in public spending because we will have older populations and so on. I have a feeling that this is not necessarily a good policy. If we are to sustain all these other systems that we mentioned before, health, pensions, long-term care, that I will come in a moment, we need to have extremely productive workers. And extremely productive workers means spending in education, training, R&D, anything that enhances productivity. Finally, I come to the question of long-term care. Long-term care is probably the elephant in the room for most European countries and other countries outside Europe. I have the feeling that there is some room for better spending there, in the sense that in several countries they are using as a substitute of non-existent long-term care facilities, especially hospital facilities. hospital is far more expensive than a long-term care unit. Therefore, proper policy design there may bear some fruits. However, the effect of long-term care on public finances definitely will be a negative one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tsakloglu. Of course, we didn't talk only about the impact, but we talked also about the solutions, and we expanded to all the topics, not only to pensions. So we have a lot of material for discussion, and what I propose here is just to have a round with my first question and keep the second to reply and make comments on the first round questions. So I turn now to Dr. Jonathan Cribb. Jonathan Cribb is Associate Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the UK's leading independent economics research institute, and Head of Retirement Saving and Aging Division. My question is to discuss on how population aging affects public spending with regard to health, in health and long-term care sectors.
Yeah, it's a small topic, which is great to get Panos' start on it.
But Panos started on
Yeah,
this.
and I can continue. And I'm going to draw a bit on my own country. I think we all will do that. But actually, it's a testament to the OECD and the resources that the OECD produces that I went through and checked, how much of the UK is an outlier compared to, in the trends compared to the OECD, and I can tell you it's a little bit. But fundamentally, why is health such a kind of problem when it comes to the fiscal consequences of aging population? Is the age gradient in spending. I think this is quite nice from the UK's budget forecast. If you take a 10-year-old and they roughly about £1,000, 1,200 euros a year spent on them in health. A 45-year-old, it's double that. It doubles again by 65. It doubles again by 75, and it keeps on going more than exponentially after 75, after which it probably begins to plateau in the mid-80s. And so with such an extreme distribution, you can understand how you end up with such a pressure on health spending. Okay? Now, in the UK, where we have a slightly less dramatic aging demographic problem compared to some countries, that on its own is driving up real health spending by between 0.5% and 1% every year. But with health, it's not just the aging, it's the fact that on top of that you have bowel mold cost problems, you have increasing health technology of really expensive pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical technologies. You have rising incomes, which lead to greater demand for income. So the expectations of society are going up on health as well. All of these pushing up spending. And, I think that therefore, at least, as the stats showed earlier, that at least in many countries, the healthcare fiscal pressure is at least as big as the pensions one, if not bigger. In my country, it's about double the size, the healthcare fiscal pressure, health and long-term care, compared to the pensions one. Now, I think the one problem we have here is that, and this comes back to Panos' point, we actually do have experience now in OECD countries of policy measures to limit the fiscal cost of pension systems, of raising pension ages, of changes to accrual rates, of doing that in the future in ways that, while not popular, have been now done in a lot of countries. But I don't know, and I'm happy to be corrected, of similar ways of which policymakers have acted to reduce healthcare spending in the same way, potentially because it's much less acceptable to do that. It's noticeable in the United States that the Medicare age is still 65. The ages for Social Security have gone up, but Medicare is still 65. So I don't think that the policymakers, have the same experience or levers available to them on healthcare that they have on pensions. A couple of extra things in my time. So we have this healthcare fiscal pressure pushing up spending. So one perfectly reasonable argument, at least for countries with maybe lower than average taxes, is that we can raise taxes. I think that is a reasonable decision to make, but we have to remember those taxes are distortionary. And that distortions rise, usually, as a rule of thumb, quadratically with the rate of taxation. Raising taxes from 40 to 41% is a lot worse than raising them from 20 to 21%. And that in countries that we already raise a lot of tax revenue, the distortionary effects are going to get increasingly bad. So if, as societies, we're going to raise the extra tax revenue, I think that has to come along tax reform to make taxes less distortionary. The other possibility, of course, is that we don't, if we don't increase taxes and we allow healthcare spending to rise, is that other spending has to decrease. And the marginal value of that may be very high. It may be on education. It may be on infrastructure. And we're not in the 1990s now where we have a peace dividend. A lot of countries are where we can easily reduce defense spending. So I think that it is a lot harder situation because of that as well. My last thing on social care. I think that we have to see social care. Social care clearly is an enormous challenge, growing very quickly from a very low base, of dramatic charts. The bad outcomes are not just the state spending a lot of money here, though. The bad outcomes are also poor quality of care and huge financial risks to some individuals, uninsurable financial risks to some individuals in states that have little public insurance here. My personal view here is that we need to, the way through the long-term social care setting has to be some private and some public involvement, with the public involvement concentrated on protecting the poorest and ensuring the tail risks of the very high long-term care costs. But in most countries, there is still a broad middle class who will not have to pay, should be insured against the highest risks, but should be expected to pay some of the long-term care costs themselves. I think that is a reasonable middle way there. That's probably too much already, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I turn now to Dr. Angela Delia. She is the head of the unit in charge, the head of the unit of the European Commission for sustainability of public finances and public expenditure trends in the DG ECFIN. Dr. Elia is in charge of analyzing the sustainability of public finance and public expenditure, oversees the economic analysis and assessment of the sustainability of public finances in relation to short, medium, and long-term fiscal risks. And since the first speakers discussed more on specific aspects of spending, I think that it's time now to see the overview and what do mounting aging-related spending pressures imply for the overall sustainability of public finance in the EU member states, the states that you have a good picture on what is going on.
So, first of all, thank you for your question, and first and foremost, thank you for inviting me to this forum, and especially to this panel discussing aging and public finances, because as you mentioned, these are topics that are very central to the analysis and the assessment that we do at the European Commission of the public debt and more in general public finance sustainability in the 27 member states. And it's nice to see that although we did not coordinate with Felix, the analysis done by the OECD converts very much with the analysis that we do, but with, of course, a focus on our 27 member states. So to start with, and I will try to avoid to repeat too much things that have been already said earlier this afternoon and then this morning, there are, demographic changes and especially aging are going to have an heavy impact on public finances through several channels. The most obvious, again, has been said several times, is through the labor market. A shrinking working age population means everything equal, less growth, and less growth means higher public debt. And on the other hand, on the spending side, the fact that we are having, the fact that our population is growing old means that they behave differently. We have, heard Felix about saving and investment attitude, but we'll have also different needs, and we have heard Panos about also healthcare, different healthcare needs and long-term care needs. So this is why what we call the aging costs, that are projections that we do at the European Commission, but together with the member state in the aging group of the Econ Council. This is why aging costs are central to the analysis that we do on debt sustainability. And if I may say so, and I will give you in a minute a few facts and figures, the picture not only is very convergent with the one that Felix expressed about OECD countries, but if possible, it's even gloomier. So it's quite worrying, it's a source of concern. To start with, we have, when we look at the medium term, and what we call medium term is basically the next 10 years, we have between 10 and 12 European countries that are at high fiscal risks. And this is not only because of aging, it's because of existing very high level of debt and the fact of running a budgetary deficit. So if everything, the aging cost will add to the pressure and to the risk of these countries. And if I can give you indeed a few figures, currently what we call aging costs that indeed encompass pension cost, healthcare cost, long-term care, and education, were in 2022, which is the latest data available, already at 24.4% of GDP in the European Union. And when we do our projections for the next 4 or 5 decades, so until 2070, they are all on the rise, basically by more than 1 point of GDP, but it's an aggregate figure, which means that it hides a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of differences across countries, and actually for actually almost half of our countries, we see that aging cost could increase in the next 4 or 5 decades by even more than 3 points of GDP. Now, what is even more worrying is that while we do projections until 2070, actually most of this acceleration, most of this raise in costs will already is not only materializing now, but will materialize already in the next 20 years. So basically, these figures will already be there by 2045. So it's basically the time to act is now. And Panos already started covering it. Of course, we have the disaggregate on pension, on healthcare, long-term care, education. The bulk of the aging cost comes from pensions, which are already at more than 11% of GDP in the European Union. And again, most of the increase in aging cost will come from pensions. The good news is that this pattern is differentiated across countries, and actually there are countries where pension costs are going down, and this is because there have been painful but successful pension reform. So, and actually Greece is one point in case in this respect. Healthcare is the second big source of aging cost, which is already at 7%, almost 7% of GDP, and our projections in the aging group show that will increase by some 10% over the next 4 decades. And then it comes long-term care, and here while now it's relatively low, less than 2% of GDP, we expect over the next 4 decades an increase of 50%. And I think one thing that I would want to stress on long-term care, and there was a question before if we have enough people in long-term care, definitely no, there is no doubt about that. But what we see across the member states of the European Union is that the biggest pressure will be in those countries that currently rely a lot on informal care providers, basically people in the family. These are the countries that will be at higher stress when basically because of changing lifestyle, changing social norms, there will be less availability of informal care providers within the family. It has already been said, the aging report shows that education costs are going to decrease. This is because sadly we have fewer kids entering schools and education. I think both Panos and Professor Boeri earlier than me already elaborated on why this is not a good thing at all, so I'm not going to spend more time on that. Now, I think the figures are quite striking. Source of concern, also because I said most of these trends will materialize in the next 20 years. Without going in the policy recommendation that perhaps I can elaborate in the second round, okay. I think the good news is that, okay, on one end, I mean, there is a need to act now. The good news is that basically since 2020, the European Union has equipped itself with what I consider personally a very powerful instrument, is the Recovery and Resilience Facility under Next Generation EU, which basically has provided a huge boost for member states to invest in a resilient system and also to adopt reforms that normally are considered painful. Pension reform is a case, but also healthcare reforms, reorganization of the hospital system. And basically, we are starting seeing, thanks to the RRF, a lot of success stories in our member states. So basically, I would like to close my initial remark with a word of hope that basically reforms and productive investment are happening in the member states. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Angela. And now I turn to Nikos Vetas. Nikos Vetas is Professor of Economics at Athens University of Economics and Business, and the General Director of Foundation for Economic and Industrial Research here in Greece. He's an industrial economist. His main research was industrial economics, but also he was the Vice Chairman of the Growth Plan Committee of the Hellenic Republic for the Greek economy. I think year 2020 was this, the well-known in Greece Pisaridis committee. So I turned with a question on going back to potential growth reforms and whether you have to comment on would fiscal reforms be sufficient to contain the pressures from population aging, or we need a comprehensive strategy also encompassing structural reforms that would be necessary to tackle the issue.
Okay, thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I take the opportunity to wish to the Center every success. It's very imperative that it combines in-depth research, also with talking with policymakers and politicians, and I guess the Center is very well positioned to do that. I want to say a word before I get into details, and I've had the benefit of listening to all the presentations so far, not only in this panel, but since the morning, and I've been trying to think. So the first thing that crosses my mind is that, at least for Europe, the easy days are over. And of course, what do you do when the easy days are over? Okay, you at least you have to think. And when I'm saying the easy days, if you really think from the early 80s up until the debt crisis, it was just linear growth in everything. And it was a very easy time also for governments and for the states. Now this is done. And we have to deal with the fact that we have higher debt, we have a negative or flat demographic, we have to spend for climate change, and there is a 50-50 chance that come this next Thursday, we also have to spend a lot more on defense. Okay. So this is not kind of a good mix. The second thing that I have been crossing my mind, this is a little bit contrary to some of the views extended, because it was, oh, what should we do for this? And I think there was one ingredient that was lacking from the mix. And this is that facing all these trends ahead, one thing that's going to be very helpful is more flexibility, and if we give to individuals more freedom. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this, because you may, you're looking at me a little bit, if I'm some sort of extreme liberal here.
Yeah.
But what I mean by more freedom and more flexibility, I don't really see why everyone in every country should actually retire at the same time. It doesn't make any sense. I don't see why the boundaries between education and work should be so rigid. And maybe all this made sense for the last 30 years, but maybe it doesn't make sense now. So a few scattered thoughts, because the answer to your question is an emphatic yes. Unless we have changes that support more growth, we cannot even have fiscal stability. And so the first thing is, the first note here, by the way, if anyone here has any problem with sleeping too much, you can get to the IOVE website and check this report on demographics that Panos knows well, that we did 2 years ago, and there is a chapter on macro projections and then fiscal sustainability based on that. Okay. And the drop for Greece is, if I remember correctly, in 30 years from now, it's about a 25% real drop, and which makes fiscal finances not easily sustainable. Now, this is without incorporating some productivity increases. And that's kind of the key of what we want to. Now, the other thing to say here is that in some of the discussions we have been having, I am a little bit, I feel an uneasiness when it comes to how to do even welfare analysis. So suppose you are a social planner, how we used to call this thing in textbooks, right? Would you rather extend somebody's life from 90 to 91? Or give a better education to a 12-year-old? Also, what is the point? What is it that we're trying to maximize here? Because some people are going to tell you in the old times, 20 years ago, maybe the average person would retire at 50, and then they would have 15 years of healthy lives until they die. And now we will be retiring close to 70, and our life after work is going to be when we are 80. What sort of trade-off is that? So these, for me, these are genuine questions. These are not rhetorical questions, but they support very serious policy choices. Because we live in democracies, thank God, and people vote. And this is a point that Panos made, and I'm going to come back to that. And that's why I believe we need more flexibility and more freedom to people. The other thing is, when you try to make sense of the challenges ahead, countries are not like businesses. Countries do not have balance sheets. So we do not have a sense of assets and liabilities. The finance ministry deals with debt, and then the labor ministry deals with pensions. Okay. And these two interact, but we do not, I emphasize not, no country has a clear sense of what are my assets. For instance, in Greece, the last few years we have been supporting a negative balance of payments, but this is partly because we are selling assets, the private sector primarily. Okay, real estate, businesses, etc. Okay, somewhere this should come into the equation. But long-term care, the need for completely new training programs, and all of these things, we should find a combined way to think about it. For some countries, like Greece and other countries, it is also, it is crucial that we see the whole story, so that we know when we may need to use fiscal space. You know, Greece lost 500,000 people during the decade of the debt crisis. This was a one-off shock, but if we require that for the next 10 years we have very strict fiscal discipline, that necessarily means taxing the people who are working now even more, okay? And that means that these people are going to vote with their feet and they're going to go to Germany. But this was then one-off shock. So you have to think about temporary shocks, and then you have to think about the steady state of the systems. Of course, now, the solution to many of these things can come through technology. Okay? So if you take the long-term view, are we going to have worse lives? I hope not. But this cannot come without having a lot more progress in the energy market, where we do have in biotech and in digital replacement various types of jobs. Now, these things that I said at the start, let me return to that. I do think that if you're looking ahead, and as Alvaro was saying this morning, you know, you look at your life and you're going to live 100 years, okay? Then the ability to navigate through this life and change course and decide if you want to retire early and take a low pension, or if you want to retire late, and, you know, if you want to be self-employed during some years, how you switch from one job to the other, how you switch from one country to the other. Countries that are doing better than us in Europe, one of the things that they have is more flexibility. And I'm talking about the rising economies in Asia and the US. So if we don't want to be losing people to these, we are already losing all our companies to these economies, okay? But if we don't want to be losing people, and the reason that we are not losing people right now is because of the strong social state, okay? But will we be able to support it unless we do some further things? So more flexibility in these systems. It doesn't make sense, for instance, that in any country pensions is 100% state-run. It doesn't make sense that all the schools are kind of exactly the same hours and exactly the same curriculum, stuff like that. Then you may say, yes, are you saying that there is no role for the state? Not at all, that's not what I'm saying. The number one thing in countries that they don't have it is a completely comprehensive, that the state should support all the basics, including something that countries like Greece do not have, which is a comprehensive and free-for-all preschool system for newborns and young children. This is imperative not only because it's going to free up also families, and let's be realistic here, at least in the South, this means women, from the extra burden, but there are all sorts of studies by real scientists, not economists, that basically show that what happens in the brain of kids until they are 2 or 3 years old is very essential. So this is one thing that's very important. The other thing that's very important is that the state provides a safety net. I wouldn't be against, for instance, saying something like, once you get 18, the state guarantees to you every month an income, no matter what you do, no matter who you are, and eventually it gets added to the tax scale. But then we have to create, so it has to do stuff like that. The state has to think, I fully agree with Jonathan, it has to be a collaboration of the public sector with private sector for long-term care systems. This might mean building up a parallel system of savings for that, right? We have to be saving for this, either the state or individuals. Probably the state should provide incentives for individuals to save long term. And how all these risks going to be, because, you know, maybe you're saving for your long term, but then the next day something happens and you're not going to live that long. What happens to this money? So these are hugely important questions. And I think as economists, we will not be left without work the next few years.
Okay, thank you, Nikos. We have mapped the state of the art. We identified causes, effects, and we have to be optimistic because some solutions, at least the ingredients, the solutions, they are on the table. I propose now to have a quick follow-up round, and we start with Feliz, and then we go again this way to finish with Nikos, again, to complement or to respond to the comments made by the other speakers. Okay, Feliz, please.
Yeah, I think we have been very complimentary, and I think, Nikos, your thoughts added an interesting twist with new ideas. I think that's also welcome. Also because, you know, as I mentioned before, addressing the challenges that we face really requires outside of the box thinking, right? So I think we should all take a stock of what we have achieved so far, what we did not achieve so far, and act accordingly to try to see, you know, what we can achieve. So for example, one thing Angela also mentioned before, the lack of long-term care workers. We had a meeting with somebody from Netherlands last month, and they were complaining that they have too much of people working in healthcare, like 30% of the population works in healthcare. There are reasons for it, of course, but so what I mean is that it's really that there's no one-size-fits-all story here, and that we really need to be country-specific, think out of the box what we can do for longer-term care, for bringing people into the labor force. There are certain things, as mentioned before, there's a lots of pushback from elderly generations too, because also, of course, this idea of retiring and living in a summer place for the next 25 years is not feasible anymore. So we need to address all of that and to find a way to incentivize them to participate and disincentivize early retirement. So that would be my conclusion, that I think the first is that the challenges are really big and require very comprehensive policy action and urgent action. And we should be open to different ideas, given that the country's starting points, their cultural values, their norms, and the political environments are completely different.
Okay, thank you. Panos.
I took more than my fair share when I was having, let's say, my first round. Therefore, I would rather give my time to the rest of the people. There was only one point that I would like to point out, and it was mentioned by Angela. All these policies we're talking about, even in the most optimistic of the scenario that we say, most probably will increase spending. There's no question about it. It is a far more difficult situation when you start from an already high level of debt than from a low level of debt. This is truism. And unfortunately, what's happening nowadays with all developed countries is that they are starting from a very high debt level, just as an observation, which makes things even more difficult.
Jonathan.
Yeah, so I want to come back to Nikos's point about kind of structural changes, and I think that a lot of structural problems are often seen as, you know, insurmountable. They're big problems. There's a lot of pessimism about them, and I think sometimes that's correct. I think where there are big problems and we don't know how to deal with them, you know, we don't really know how to get fertility back up above 2, okay? But in other countries, we do know what works well. And so my slightly counterintuitive optimism is, I think where you know where your country has a structural problem, and you know from other countries how to address that, then you can really see results. And the minister was talking earlier about the removal of the penalty for working and claiming your pension. We removed that in 1992-ish in Britain. So we didn't get the benefit in the late 2010s or the, you know.
Okay.
if you have an extremely distortionary tax system and you can reform it a bit, then that can really push you on. In my country, we have an awful problem with housing regulation. If we can solve that, if we can move a bit more towards other countries do, we can make a lot of progress there. So I think that you can see some of this optimism for structural reform in the places where we know that other countries have been successful. I think it is harder where we all have problems and we don't know what policy levers to pull.
Back to pessimism. Okay.
Oh, well, I have to be a little bit.
Okay. Please, Angela.
Yes, thank you. I would like perhaps to start to complement what Nikos was saying, and I would like to pick up on the need of a flexible approach. And I would start with a flexible approach to retirement policy, because this is actually something that we are advocating, that we need indeed to avoid endpoints that are equal for each and every one. We cannot afford anymore to consider all the people of the same age, all at the same time and unfit for work at the same time. And this, in our view, would also help to take in consideration that people with lower attainment are expected to enter first in the job market, but also, sadly, have also a lower life expectancy. So this is why we are stressing very much that it's important to link retirement schemes to the length of the career as a first basic principle. And the second thing that I want to elaborate on pension reform, one thing that actually it was mentioned, I think, by Felix, is that actually we still see in many of our member states the existence and persistence of many preferential schemes, special regimes. And in most cases, perhaps not in all cases, but in most cases, they are just a legacy of the past, legacy of a vested interest. So we do believe that actually this needs to be tackled, because keeping them unchanged actually affects the legitimacy of a pension reform. And we have heard several times that pension reform normally rank at the very bottom of popularity. Of course, if we don't start changing preferential schemes, even the legitimacy of this reform will go lower, which brings me to last point, at least on pension reform. One thing that we are also stressing a lot is that these are reforms, and it's not only about pension reform, also hospital reforms are the same thing, that requires a lot of preparedness, require a lot of ownership within the country. They need to be explained to the citizens, the benefits need to be explained, because otherwise the risk of reversal, as we are seeing in some large of our member states, it's huge. So they need to be explained, they need to be prepared. Citizens really need to understand the benefit. If I have just one more minute, because I've covered so far pension reform, on healthcare and long-term care, I think that in both these areas, there is basically two objectives that should go hand in hand. Well, the first obvious objective is the, let's say, the health outcome for the patient. But given that here we are in the session of public finances, we need to keep in mind the cost effectiveness of this system. So, for instance, one thing that we are advocating a lot as policy recommendation in the European Commission is really to rethink and moving away from systems that are centered on hospitals to systems that actually are centered on primary care. So we think that basically the system should be rebalanced, because primary care has basically the potential, well, first of all, to provide timely diagnosis, and in the medium term, less costly treatment to patients, together with a better outcome. And similarly for long-term care, we think that really there is a need to rethink a rebalancing between home care and residential care. And I would stop it here for
Okay, thank you very much. And Nikos, the last.
So just then 2 quick points. One, in terms of who decides and for whom, as Panos said, at least in the old textbooks, when you talked about the population problem, it was kind of that we're getting too many. And then the question is relative to what metric. I guess like in a center like that, one has to take the global view and say, you know, is it better if us humans is something like we are like 10 billion or if we are like 5 billion? Especially if you relate this with environmental challenges, it's not clear what the answer is, what is better, right? So better for whom? Also, what are the means to achieve this thing, right? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, the most pronounced intervention in terms of population in the recent history was what happened in China, which was not exactly, I would say, a measure that respected individual freedoms, to put it mildly, okay? So how do we feel about such sort of interventions? And in retrospect, you know, it's kind of a little bit sad to say, but maybe it's a little bit better globally that China is not today 2 billion, but it is kind of around 1. But, you know, was what happened justified? The one-child policy, that's what I'm talking about. And so these are for me, these are difficult questions. But my second point, and there was, a few people mentioned this, but also Panos, I think, is kind of the political economy of all this, right? Because it's not just that in the population it's going to be now primarily retired people relative to young ones, but I think if the trend continues that young people abstain from politics, those who vote are probably, maybe in some countries, you know, 4 out of 5 is going to be not youngsters, but people who but people that care about their pension. And Ari, you can see how easily this can escalate into a dynamic where the government actually decides that these are my clients, this is who I'm going to care for, especially because the reforms we're talking about, as Angela said, you do something today and you get the fruits in 20 years. If you're a politician, 20 years is 20 years, I guess. So what do you do? Right? Unless you have, do you have market discipline? Do you have a market that is gonna, do you have what sort of disciplines? Do you have EU discipline? Okay, what are the disciplines here? But if you actually don't do the right thing, which is to make the young generation more productive, then these people are just gonna walk out. They're gonna go somewhere else where they're not going to be taxed marginally at 60%. And then the situation becomes even more unstable. So the political economy of this, and how we actually, and what's the responsibility for, you know, for the OECD, for academics, for whoever, to inform the politicians and the people. I think this is kind of, seems like a very important challenge.
Okay, thank you very much, Nico. And just a final remark from my side. I think this is the goal of an enterprise such as the OECD Forum. It's located at the heart of the evidence-informed policy making. The experts provide the evidence, but the evidence, it's argument, it's not data. And the politicians, they take the decisions. So our job is to make them to take the better decisions, informed decisions. I mean, to argue among us. And what we see here is that there is not one-size-fits-all solution. There are ingredients of the solution. And the best thing that we can do is to put together those who are taking decisions with those who are producing data and to give them the capacity to take informed decisions. And of course, democracy is at the heart of this, what is called politics by deliberation. It's better to exchange arguments relying on evidence and on persuasion than arguing in general without, more emotional kind of reaction. Well, thank you very much, and we move on exactly on time, not the red. Yes. We have 10 seconds, 9 seconds now.
It was the panel on fiscal discipline.
It's the only panel that respected the time. Thank you very much.